Hello. The Divine Code reading for September 5th, pages 179 and 180. We are in the chapter on the service of Molech. Topic number 5. This prohibition includes sons and daughters, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and so forth. So one is liable for any of his descendants because all descendants are included in the Hebrew term used for progeny in the source verse. But if a man passed his brother, sister, an ancestor, or himself through the fire, or if he led one of his descendants through the fire when the descendant was blind or sleepwalking, he is not liable for capital punishment by the court. See Rambam Laws of the Worship of Stars and Idols 6:5. Since these are not customary manner of serving Molech. So it would have to be one of his progeny. The word used is for that. And so another relative would not count, or himself would not count, because he or his other relatives would not be considered progeny. Just as children and grandchildren and such. Also, the leading, bringing the person through the fire, if the person is not cognitive of what's going on, or if he's blind, it would not fit the description of what happens with Molech. The specifics of the service of Molech would not include a person who's blind or a person that's not aware of what's going on. Likewise, a woman who passed some of her descendants over to Molech, even with the exact customary ritual of its in other details, is not liable for capital punishment by a physical court. So that when understanding halakha, it often requires very specific things in order for something to be the case. Now, we can also have philosophy that tries to understand the inner meanings and all that of things, but that's not what we're looking at in the Divine Code and halakha. We're looking specifically at how the Torah, how the halakha functions. So if it was the mother rather than the father doing this, it would not count as such, according to the straight halakhic understanding. Topic number 6. If one passed a child after that same child had already been passed, whether it was the father who had originally passed the child and did so again, or if it was someone else, such as a grandfather, who passed the child a second time, or if the first was the grandfather and the second the father, he is not liable for punishment by court, since this is not the usual way of serving Molech. So the Molech is like a dedication service, and the child can only be dedicated one time. So if the child is dedicated additional times, it does not fit the criteria as service to Molech. See Miri on Tractate Sanhedrin 64 in his explanation of the service of Molech, which is the introduction of a child into the covenant of believers of Molech. It is therefore understood that once the child was passed to Molech, one did not pass the child again, and to do so was not its customary ritual. Rambam writes in Leviticus 18:21, they passed the child over the fire many times. That's Ramban. They passed the child over the fire many times, and he is then liable from the time of the first passing, which simply implies that even one who passed the child who was already passed is liable. So this is a case where there's different rabbis that understand it differently, and for that reason, because of the uncertainty, that's why they're stating that it's not liable in a court of law. Because for the first time, everybody agrees for the first time that the person that does the passing, the father, the grandfather, and such, that person would be liable for the first passing. There's disagreement on subsequent passings, and because of the disagreement, it would not be a capital offense in a physical court. It might be a heavenly court offense, so it's still something to be taken very seriously, but it would not be handled by the physical court. Ramban's opinion is that the service was the actual burning of children in fire, and it was considered an offering to Moloch when the body caught on fire, or at least when it was the father's intention that he attempted to carry out. And every time the father passed his child, he was once again offering the child. In contrast, Rambam's opinion is that the service of Molech was only to pass the child in between pyres of fire, as was the traditional way of making a covenant by passing between two things. This is also Rashi's opinion in the exclamation on Tractate Sanhedrin 34b. This is explained by Muri. Thus, as explained by Muri, passing a child a second time has no significance over the first time. So once the child has been passed, there's different opinions about what the service of Molech involved. One is it's the base level, which is what we're talking about here, the base level understanding of dedicating the child. There's also other understandings that there are multiple levels, multiple stages of dedication. So the first level of dedication is the father is walking along between the fires. The other levels of service would involve more and more extreme types of dedication, up to the point of actually burning the child. And then the question would be, if the child has already been dedicated the first time and they're doing this higher level dedication, would the parent be liable for the second dedication, or is he just liable for the first dedication? That's what's being argued here. It would appear that it would appear to me that everybody would agree that if they're doing the same level of dedication, it wouldn't make a difference. You only can be dedicated on that level one time. But if they do higher stages of dedication, perhaps there's a liability for the higher level. If it's repeated on a higher level, perhaps then there's liability. But that's not really being addressed at this point, because there's uncertainty about that. A father who passed a second different one of his children after passing the first is liable. So assuming that assuming there's a child left over after the different dedications, because they passed some of their children but not all their children. So let's say there's 5 children. The father passed the one child through the fire, and then later on he passes a second child through the fire. He's also liable for the second child. There was, however, another idol whose ritual was to burn one's sons and daughters in fire. This is as it says in Deuteronomy 12:31. All the abominations of God, etc. they did to their gods, as they also burned their sons and daughters in fire to their gods. Moloch is not specifically mentioned there, but rather another idol for which the service was done. This practice is mentioned in 2 Kings chapter 17 and Jeremiah 7:31 and Rashi on that. For doing so, one was liable as for any other type of idol worship. Rambam, The Laws of the Stars of Worship and Idols, 6:3. This means that this idol did not have the specific rulings regarding Moloch that are mentioned in this chapter. Meaning that even if one burned all of his children to this idol, or just some of his children, he was liable. This worship ritual does not need to include giving the children over to the idol's priest or passing them through the fire, as was done for Moloch. A person who did this was also liable for causing the death of his children. So the rule, what they're explaining here is that the rules that they're setting forth concerning Moloch, that is specific to Moloch. The rules about some of his children, but not all of his children, and the rules about passing the child over to the priest and the priest handing the child back. These are specific aspects to Moloch. We're not to understand it as a general form of idol worship that would apply to other idols. Each idol has its own set rules about how they're served. And when doing a service specific to one idol, it would not apply to another idol. That's what they're accentuating at this point, explaining at this point. He also if an idol worship involves another offense, if it involved eating the limbs of a living animal or something to that effect, not only would the person be liable for serving the idol, they would also be liable for the other offense that was involved in the worship of the idol. Even if one performs this service for another idol that does not have this as his traditional ritual, he is still liable for a capital sin as a result of the service, and is one who burns anything as an offering to the idol. That's in the Keshet Mishnah. As explained above in topic chapter 3, topic 20, this liability exists separately from the liability for murder. So let's say that we're in a situation where the person does a act of idol worship, and in the process he also commits another act. If we're in a time when there's leniency on one, but strictness on the other, the person is not going to receive leniency. Let's say the court is existing in a time when there's idol worship that that people learn from their parents. They don't really know what they're doing. It's a culture. They grew up in a culture. They don't know what they're doing. Therefore, there might be leniency in that society in the case of idol worship. However, if the idol worship involves murder, then there would not be leniency in the case of murder. But it would be prosecuted as a case of murder. It would not be necessarily be prosecuted as a case of idol worship. But there would still be a prosecution in the case of the murder. Topic number 8. The practice of some midwives to take an infant in swaddling clothes, place a spice which does not smell good on a fire, and wave the infant over the spice of the fire. It is a type of passing through fire and is forbidden. Rambam Guides to the Perplexed, Volume 3, Chapter 37. So in this case, it's sort of a magical, superstitious custom that is probably based on this ancient custom of Molech. You know, so there's things that people do if in the case of an idolatry such as Molech, there might be after effects in the society where they do customs, not necessarily knowing why they do it, but they're doing a custom that goes back to an ancient idolatry. Even if that idolatry has been forgotten, they're still doing certain rituals. And in this case, the woman is doing it, the midwife is doing it, so she would not be liable in the case of Molech, but she's doing something that remembers back to a forgotten past. So it's forbidden to do this, as a lot of actions of magic in that they're forbidden to do, even if we don't remember why it is. It would not be a court case. It's just something that we should not do. We shouldn't do these things, and it's difficult to know. In our society, there's so many things that people do: throwing coins in a wishing well, not stepping on cracks. There's things that people do, they don't remember why. It's best to not get too wrapped up in these ancient customs. Thank you.